20 years ago, I made a decision that changed everything. I walked into a cold, sterile room and sat face to face with the man who destroyed my world, the man who took my only child from me in the most brutal way imaginable. But what happened in that room, what I said to him, what he said to me, will shock you more than anything you could ever imagine. This is not just a story about loss. This is about something far more powerful, something that most people think is impossible when evil strikes at the heart of everything you love. My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone calls me Maggie. I am 62 years old, and for the past 2 decades, I have carried a burden that no mother should ever have to bear. I have walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and I have emerged on the other side with a truth so profound that it has the power to heal the deepest wounds of the human heart. Today, I want to share with you the most difficult journey of my life, a journey that began with the worst night any parent could imagine, and ended with something that will challenge everything you believe about justice, mercy, and the power of God's love. But before I tell you what happened in that room 20 years later, before I reveal the shocking words that were spoken between a grieving mother and the man who shattered her world, I need to take you back to where it all began. Back to a time when my life was simple, when my heart was full, and when I believed that God's protection was a shield around everything I held dear. It was December 15th, 1998, in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The snow was falling gently outside my classroom window at Lincoln Elementary School, and I was helping little Sarah Matthews with her Christmas card for her grandmother. I remember the moment so clearly because it was the last moment of true peace I would know for many, many years. My phone rang at exactly 3:47 in the afternoon. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but the words that came through that receiver would echo in my mind for the next 2 decades. Your son has been shot. He's been taken to university hospitals in Des Moines. You need to come right away. If you have ever lost someone you love, if you have ever felt your world crumble beneath your feet, if you have ever questioned whether God truly exists in the midst of unimaginable pain, then please stay with me. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe to our channel, because what I am about to share with you might just change the way you see forgiveness forever. David was my everything. At 19 years old, he was studying engineering at the University of Iowa, and his dream was to build bridges. Not just any bridges, but bridges that would connect communities, bridges that would bring people together. He used to tell me that every bridge was a symbol of hope, a way for people to cross over from where they were to where they needed to be. Oh, how prophetic those words would become, though neither of us could have known it at the time. He was brilliant, kind, and had a heart for helping others. Every weekend, he would drive the hour and a half home to Cedar Falls just to have Sunday dinner with me and help with yard work. He was the kind of son that other mothers envied, the kind of young man who held doors open for elderly ladies and always called to let me know he had arrived safely wherever he was going. He was my miracle baby, born after years of trying and praying, after 3 miscarriages that had left me wondering if I would ever experience the joy of motherhood. The drive to Des Moines that December night was the longest drive of my life. My sister Susan met me at the hospital, her face telling me everything I needed to know before the doctors even spoke the words. David had been shot 3 times during what police called a robbery gone wrong. He had been leaving a movie theater at Southridge Mall with his girlfriend Jenny when a young man approached them in the parking lot demanding money. David had immediately given him his wallet, his watch, everything he had, but it wasn't a tea enough. The shooter, later identified as 17-year-old Tyler Rodriguez, had been high on methamphetamine and paranoid. When David moved to shield Jenny, Tyler panicked and fired. $40. That was what my son's life was worth to his killer. $40 and a plastic watch I had bought him for his 16th birthday. Jenny survived physically, but she was never the same. She moved away from Iowa within a month, unable to face the memories that haunted every corner of our small college town. I understood. I wanted to run too, but where do you run when the pain lives inside your heart? The trial was a blur of legal proceedings, victim impact statements, and media attention that I never wanted. Tyler Rodriguez was tried as an adult and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I remember sitting in that courtroom, looking at this skinny kid who barely looked old enough to drive, and feeling a rage so pure and consuming that I thought it might actually kill me right there in my seat. His mother tried to approach me after the sentencing. She was crying, wanting to apologize, wanting to tell me how sorry she was. I turned away. I couldn't bear to look at her. Couldn't bear to acknowledge that this monster had a mother who loved him when my own son would never come home again. For the first few years after David's death, I existed in a fog of grief and anger. I had been a woman of faith my entire life, active in Cedar Falls Methodist Church, teaching Sunday school, organizing church dinners, believing wholeheartedly in God's goodness and protection. But when David died, all of that crumbled. How could a loving God allow such senseless violence? How could my prayers for David's safety, prayers I had whispered every single night since he was born, go unanswered in such a horrific way? I stopped going to church. I stopped praying. I stopped believing that God cared about the pain of one broken-hearted mother in small-town Iowa. Pastor Williams tried to visit, tried to offer comfort with scriptures about God's plan and heaven's gain, but his words felt empty and hollow. They bounced off the wall of bitterness that had grown around my heart like armor. My principal at Lincoln Elementary was incredibly understanding, granting me leave after leave as I struggled to function. The children I had once loved teaching seemed like painful reminders of the life David would never have. Every mother dropping off her child became a knife in my heart. Every graduation ceremony I attended was a reminder of the college graduation I would never see, the wedding I would never plan, the grandchildren I would never hold. I retreated into my small house on Maple Street, the same house where David had taken his first steps, where we had celebrated every Christmas morning, where his bedroom remained exactly as he had left it the last time he came home. His engineering textbooks still stacked on his desk, his Iowa Hawkeyes sweatshirt still hanging in the closet, his toothbrush still in the bathroom cup. My sisters tried everything to help me. Susan would bring groceries and sit with me in silence when words failed. Patricia would call every day, sometimes just to make sure I was still breathing. They arranged for therapy, for grief counseling, for support groups, but I refused them all. I wasn't ready to heal. Healing felt like betrayal, like moving on meant forgetting David, and forgetting David was something I would never, ever do. The only place I found any peace was at Graceland Cemetery, where David was buried under a simple headstone that read, David Michael Thompson, beloved son, he built bridges of love. Every Sunday, I would pack a small lunch and spend the entire day there talking to him, telling him about my week, asking him why this had happened, begging him to somehow let me know he was okay. It was during one of these cemetery visits, about 3 years after David's death, that I first heard the name Tyler Rodriguez spoken in any context other than hatred. An older gentleman named Frank was visiting a grave nearby, and we struck up a conversation. His grandson had been killed by a drunk driver, and he mentioned that he had started visiting the driver in prison. The idea horrified me. How could he face the person who had destroyed his family? How could he sit in the same room with such evil? But Frank said something that stayed with me. He told me that carrying hatred was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. He said that visiting the driver hadn't been about forgiveness at first, but about understanding, about trying to make sense of the senseless. That night, I went home, and for the first time in 3 years, I opened David's Bible. It was a gift I had given him for his confirmation, and I knew he had been reading it regularly before he died. Jenny had told me that David had been talking about maybe changing his major to social work, that he wanted to help kids who had gotten into trouble find better paths. The irony was crushing. My son had wanted to help kids like Tyler Rodriguez, and one of them had killed him. I flipped through the pages, many of them marked with David's neat handwriting in the margins. There were passages about forgiveness, about loving your enemies, about God's mercy, extending even to the worst sinners. These weren't new concepts to me. I had taught them in Sunday school for years, but reading them now in the context of my own devastating loss, they seemed impossible. They seemed like pretty words for people who had never really suffered. But there was one passage that David had not only highlighted, but had written a note beside. Matthew 6, verse 14 through 15. If you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. In David's handwriting beside it, he had written, "Forgiveness isn't about them, it's about us." I closed the Bible and cried harder than I had since the night David died. My son, my beautiful, wise son, had understood something at 19 that I was struggling to grasp at 52. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing the inexcusable or pretending that terrible things hadn't happened. It was about freeing your own heart from the prison of hatred. But knowing this intellectually and feeling it in my heart were two completely different things. For the next several years, I wrestled with God, with my faith, with the very concept of forgiveness. I would have good days where I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could find a way forward. And then I would have terrible days where the rage would consume me all over again, where I would fantasize about Tyler Rodriguez suffering in prison, where I would hope that someone would hurt him the way he had hurt my David. It was Pastor Michael Harrison who finally helped me find my way back to God. He arrived at Cedar Falls Methodist in 2012, a young man fresh out of seminary with kind eyes and a gentle spirit. Unlike Pastor Williams, who had tried to explain away my pain with theological platitudes, Pastor Michael simply sat with me in my darkness. He didn't try to fix me or rush me through my grief. He just loved me where I was. He started by asking if he could pray for me, not with me, just for me. He would stop by my house once a week, not to preach or counsel, but just to let me know that he was bringing my name before God every single day. Slowly, very slowly, his persistent love began to crack the wall around my heart. It was Pastor Michael who suggested I might find healing in helping others who were walking through similar valleys. He told me about a support group that met at the community center for parents who had lost children to violence. The thought terrified me. I had become comfortable in my isolation, safe in my private grief. Opening up to strangers about the worst thing that had ever happened to me felt impossible. But David's voice seemed to whisper in my heart, encouraging me to be brave, to step out of my comfort zone the way he always had. So on a cold Tuesday evening in March of 2013, I walked into a circle of folding chairs and met other parents whose lives had been shattered by violence. There was Robert Martinez, whose 18-year-old son Carlos had been killed by a drunk driver. There was Linda Foster, whose 22-year-old daughter Michelle had been murdered by an abusive boyfriend. There was James Wright, whose 16-year-old son Anthony had been shot in a drive-by shooting while walking home from basketball practice. Listening to their stories, seeing their pain, understanding that I wasn't alone in this devastating club that no parent ever wants to join, began to heal something deep inside me. We shared memories of our children. We cried together, we raged together, and slowly, we began to hope together. It was Linda who first talked about forgiveness. Her daughter's killer had been sentenced to 25 years to life, and Linda had spent the first 5 years after Michelle's death consumed with hatred. But she told us about a moment when she realized that her hatred was destroying her remaining relationships with her other children, her husband, her friends. She said that Michelle wouldn't have wanted her life to be defined by hatred of the man who had taken her away. Linda's words planted a seed in my heart that would take years to grow. The idea that David wouldn't want my life to be consumed by hatred toward Tyler Rodriguez was both comforting and challenging. David had been such a loving, forgiving person. He had been the kind of kid who befriended the lonely children at school, who stood up for those who were being bullied, who saw the best in everyone he met. As I continued attending the support group and slowly rebuilt my relationship with God, I began to volunteer at a local youth center. It was my first step back into the world of helping others, and working with at-risk teenagers began to open my eyes to the kind of life Tyler Rodriguez might have lived before that terrible night in December. Many of these kids came from broken homes, from poverty, from neighborhoods where violence was a daily reality. They had been failed by the adults who were supposed to protect them, failed by systems that were supposed to help them, failed by a society that had written them off before they even had a chance. This didn't excuse what Tyler had done to David, but it helped me understand that people who commit terrible acts are often victims themselves long before they become perpetrators. Working with these teenagers also showed me how desperately they needed adults who believed in them, who saw their potential instead of their mistakes. Several of the young men I worked with reminded me of David in their intelligence and their desire to build better lives for themselves. I began to wonder what might have happened if Tyler Rodriguez had met someone like David before drugs and desperation led him to that parking lot. It was during this time that I began to pray again, tentatively at first, then with growing fervor. My prayers weren't the simple, trusting prayers of my youth. They were wrestling matches with God, honest conversations about my pain, my confusion, my anger. I prayed for David, for his soul, for peace in whatever realm he now inhabited. I prayed for Jenny, who was trying to rebuild her life in California. I prayed for my sisters, who had loved me through my darkest years. And eventually, though it took enormous effort, I began to pray for Tyler Rodriguez. Praying for Tyler felt like betrayal at first. How could I ask God to bless the man who had murdered my son? But as I continued to volunteer with at-risk youth, as I saw how many of them were just a few bad decisions away from becoming either victims or perpetrators of violence, my prayers for Tyler became less about blessing him and more about asking God to somehow use even this terrible situation for good. The breakthrough came during a youth group session in 2016. I was working with a 15-year-old named Marcus who had been arrested for armed robbery. He was angry, defensive, convinced that the world was against him and that he had no choices other than crime. As I listened to his story, I heard echoes of what Tyler Rodriguez's life might have been like. Marcus had grown up in poverty, had been abandoned by his father, had a mother who struggled with addiction. He was intelligent and capable, but he had never had anyone invest in his potential. Working with Marcus, I realized that if someone like David could reach someone like Marcus, if my son's dream of building bridges between communities could somehow extend to building bridges between people who had hurt each other, then maybe David's death wouldn't be completely meaningless. Maybe there was a way to honor his memory that went beyond simply surviving my grief. That night, I went home and did something I had been avoiding for 18 years. I researched Tyler Rodriguez. Not the news articles about the crime, which I had read obsessively in the early years, but information about his life in prison. What I found surprised me. Tyler had earned his JED while incarcerated. He had been attending church services regularly. He had completed several vocational training programs and had been working as a tutor for other inmates who were trying to get their high school diplomas. According to the Iowa Department of Corrections website, he had been involved in a program that brought troubled youth into the prison to see the consequences of criminal choices. Reading about Tyler's apparent transformation stirred something unexpected in my heart. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall of hatred I had built around his name. If God could change a murderer into someone who was trying to help others avoid his mistakes, then maybe there was more to this story than I had allowed myself to consider. It was around this time that Pastor Michael told me about a program called Bridges of Healing, a restorative justice initiative that brought together victims and offenders for facilitated conversations. The program was completely voluntary and only proceeded if both parties agreed to participate. Pastor Michael didn't push the idea. He simply mentioned it as something I might want to pray about. The thought of sitting in the same room as Tyler Rodriguez made me physically ill. Even after all the healing I had experienced, even after all the spiritual growth and volunteer work and prayer, the idea of facing David's killer seemed impossible. But the name of the program kept echoing in my mind. Bridges of Healing. David had wanted to build bridges. Maybe this was a bridge I was supposed to cross. I prayed about it for months. I talked to my support group about it. Linda Foster, who had participated in a similar program with her daughter's killer, encouraged me to at least consider it. She said that meeting face-to-face with the person who had taken Michelle's life hadn't magically erased her pain, but it had given her a sense of closure that nothing else had provided. The program coordinator, a compassionate woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, explained that the process would be gradual. First, there would be separate preparation sessions with both Tyler and me. Then, if we both felt ready, there would be an initial meeting with mediators present. The goal was necessarily forgiveness, Dr. Chen explained, but rather understanding and hopefully some measure of healing for both parties. The more I learned about the program, the more I felt David E.'s presence encouraging me to take this step. My son had been studying engineering, but his heart had been drawn toward helping people. In his last conversation with me before he died, he had talked about maybe switching majors to social work because he wanted to help kids who had gotten into trouble find better paths. The irony wasn't lost on me that one of those kids had taken his life. But what if David E.'s death could somehow be transformed into something that helped others? What if facing Tyler Rodriguez could help me understand how to better help the teenagers I was working with? What if this meeting could somehow honor David S.'s memory by building the kind of bridge he had always wanted to build? In August of 2018, nearly 20 years after David S.'s death, I made the call to Dr. Chen and told her I was ready to begin the process. What happened next would challenge everything I thought I knew about justice, mercy, and the impossible power of forgiveness. But that conversation, that moment when I first heard Tyler Rodriguez's voice as a man instead of the monster in my nightmares, that shocking revelation about what he had become in prison, that is a story that deserves to be told carefully, completely, and with the reverence it deserves. Because what Tyler said to me in that first phone call, what I learned about his transformation, and what ultimately transpired between a grieving mother and the man who had destroyed her world, will challenge everything you believe about whether true redemption is possible for those who commit the unforgivable. The preparation process for the Bridges of Healing program took 3 months. Dr. Chen met with me weekly, helping me articulate what I hoped to gain from meeting Tyler and preparing me for the emotional challenges that lay ahead. She explained that Tyler had been participating in the program for over a year, working through his own preparation process, examining the full impact of his actions not just on David and me, but on his own family, on the community, on everyone whose lives had been touched by that terrible night. During one of our sessions, Dr. Chen showed me a letter that Tyler had written as part of his preparation process. It wasn't addressed to me specifically, but rather to David. In it, Tyler expressed his profound remorse and talked about how he thought about David every single day of his 20 years in prison. He wrote about the young man he had been, consumed by drugs and desperation, and the man he had become through years of reflection, education, and faith. Reading that letter was one of the most difficult things I had ever done. For 2 decades, I had carried an image of Tyler Rodriguez as a monster, a soulless creature who had destroyed my world for $40. But the words on that page were written by someone who was clearly tormented by what he had done, someone who had spent 20 years trying to understand how he had become capable of such violence. The letter mentioned David's girlfriend, Jenny, and how Tyler had learned that she had suffered from post-traumatic stress for years after witnessing the shooting. It talked about David's dreams of becoming an engineer and how Tyler had since learned about bridge building, about connecting communities, about the metaphorical bridges that David had wanted to create. Tyler wrote about how he spent time in the prison library reading about engineering, trying to understand the mind of the young man whose life he had stolen. But what struck me most was Tyler's description of finding faith in prison. He wrote about how empty and lost he had felt for the first several years of his incarceration, how he had been angry at the world, angry at his circumstances, angry at everyone except himself. He described hitting rock bottom around 2005 when his mother died while he was in prison and he wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. That was his moment of reckoning, when he finally accepted full responsibility for the choices that had led him to that point. Tyler wrote about finding a prison chaplain named Father Martinez, who didn't try to excuse his actions or minimize the harm he had caused, but who helped him understand that even the worst sinners could find redemption through God's grace. He described years of Bible study, of learning to read properly because his education had been so poor when he entered prison, of slowly coming to understand the full magnitude of what he had taken from the world when he killed David. The letter concluded with Tyler expressing his desire to somehow honor David's memory through his remaining years in prison. He had become a mentor to younger inmates, helping them earn their high school diplomas and trying to steer them away from the path of violence that had destroyed his own life. He had written to engineering schools asking for textbooks and course materials so he could better understand the field that David had been passionate about. He said that learning about bridges had become his way of staying connected to the young man he had killed, his way of trying to understand the good that had been lost when he pulled that trigger. Reading Tyler E.'s words about David was both heartbreaking and healing. It was clear that my son had become more than just a victim to Tyler. He had become a real person, someone whose dreams and potential Tyler understood and mourned. This wasn't the kind of callous indifference I had imagined. This was genuine remorse and a sincere attempt to honor David's memory. Dr. Chen asked me how I felt after reading the letter, and I honestly didn't know. It was easier to hate a monster than to confront the reality that Tyler Rodriguez was a human being who had made terrible choices, but who was capable of growth and remorse. It was easier to maintain my anger than to consider the possibility that 20 years of imprisonment, education, and spiritual development might have genuinely transformed the person who had destroyed my world. After weeks of preparation, Dr. Chen suggested that Tyler and I have our first contact through a phone call. The call would be monitored and recorded, and either of us could end it at any time if we felt uncomfortable. The purpose was simply to hear each other's voices and to confirm that we both still wanted to proceed with an in-person meeting. I remember the morning of that first phone call with crystal clarity. It was a Tuesday in November, exactly 20 years minus 1 month from the day David had been killed. I sat in Dr. Chen's office, staring at the phone on her desk, knowing that in a few minutes I would hear the voice of my son's killer for the first time since his sentencing hearing 2 decades earlier. When the call connected and Tyler said hello, I was shocked by how different his voice sounded. At 17, he had been just a kid with a high, uncertain voice. Now he spoke with the deep, measured tones of a man who had spent years thinking carefully about his words. There was a sadness in his voice that was immediately apparent, but also a strength that surprised me. Tyler began by thanking me for being willing to participate in the program. He said he knew how difficult it must be for me, and that he was grateful for the opportunity to speak with me directly. Then he said something that I had not expected. He told me that he had been praying for me every day for the past 20 years. Hearing that from the man who had killed my son was jarring. How could he pray for me when he was the source of my pain? But as Tyler explained his daily prayers, I began to understand that they weren't too casual or self-serving. He prayed for my healing, for my peace, for God to somehow bring good out of the terrible thing he had done. He prayed that I would be able to find joy again, that David's memory would be a blessing rather than a burden, that somehow my life could still have meaning, despite the enormous loss I had suffered. Tyler also told me about his mother, Maria Rodriguez, who had died of cancer while he was in prison. He said that she had talked about me often in her letters, wondering how I was coping, whether I had family to support me, whether I would ever be able to find peace. Maria had wanted to reach out to me over the years, but had been advised by lawyers that any contact might be seen as harassment. Instead, she had asked her church to pray for the Thompson family every Sunday for 20 years. Learning that Tyler A.'s mother had carried me in her heart for 2 decades was overwhelming. I had never considered that his family might be suffering too, that they might feel genuine remorse for what their son had done. Maria Rodriguez had lost her son too, in a different way, and she had spent the last 20 years of her life carrying the burden of his actions. As our conversation continued, Tyler asked if he could tell me about David. Not about the night he was killed, but about what Tyler had learned about him in the years since. Tyler had requested and received copies of newspaper articles about David, his obituary, stories about his academic achievements, and his dreams of becoming an engineer. Tyler had also somehow obtained information about David's volunteer work with Habitat for Humanity and his involvement in his church youth group. Tyler told me that he had learned about David's girlfriend Jenny and how much David had loved her, how he had been planning to propose to her after graduation. He knew about David's favorite classes, his plans to work for a firm that specialized in building infrastructure in developing countries, his dream of someday designing bridges that would connect isolated communities to resources and opportunities. As Tyler spoke about my son, I realized that he knew David better than many people who had actually known him. Tyler had spent 20 years studying the life he had ended, trying to understand the full scope of what had been lost when he made his terrible decision. This wasn't the casual knowledge of someone who had read a few news articles. This was the detailed understanding of someone who had made knowing David a central part of his own spiritual journey. Tyler asked if I would be willing to tell him more about David, about his childhood, his personality, the little things that made him special. For the first time in our conversation, my voice broke. Talking about David with his killer felt surreal, but there was something healing about sharing my son's memory with someone who clearly valued it deeply. I told Tyler about David U.S. first day of kindergarten, how he had been so excited to learn that he had packed his backpack the night before and slept with it next to his bed. I told him about David U.S.' love of building things, how he had spent hours with Legos and erector sets, always creating elaborate structures and explaining to me how they worked. I shared stories about David E.S. kindness, how he had befriended the lonely kids at school, how he had spent his allowance buying lunch for classmates whose families couldn't afford it. As I talked about David, I watched Tyler through the window of the prison visiting room where the call was taking place. He was crying. This 37-year-old man, hardened by 20 years in prison, was weeping as he listened to stories about the child who had become the young man he had killed. His tears weren't performative or manipulative. They were the genuine grief of someone who understood exactly what had been lost. Tyler asked about David's faith, and I told him about my son's confirmation, about his regular Bible reading, about his involvement in youth group and mission trips. Tyler said that learning about David's faith had been instrumental in his own spiritual journey. He said that knowing David was a Christian had made Tyler want to understand what that meant. What kind of God could create someone so good and loving? It was through studying David's faith that Tyler had eventually found his own relationship with Christ. He had started reading the Bible to better understand the young man he had killed, and through those pages, he had encountered a God who could forgive even the worst sinners. Tyler said that he often wondered if David would have wanted him to find faith, if my son would have been glad to know that his death had somehow led to Tyler Isa's spiritual transformation. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, and by the end of it, something fundamental had shifted in my heart. Tyler Rodriguez was no longer a faceless monster in my mind. He was a broken man who had spent 20 years trying to atone for the worst decision of his life. He was someone who had genuinely come to know and love my son through years of studying his life and memory. When the call ended, I sat in Dr. Chen E.'s office for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. I had expected to feel anger or renewed grief after talking to Tyler. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years, a sense that David's death might somehow serve a purpose beyond just ending his life. Dr. Chen asked me if I wanted to proceed with an in-person meeting, and to my own surprise, I said yes without hesitation. I needed to look into Tyler's eyes and see for myself whether the transformation I had heard in his voice was genuine. I needed to understand how God could take someone who had committed such evil and turn them into someone who could speak about my son with such love and reverence. The in-person meeting was scheduled for January 15, 2019, exactly 20 years and 1 month after David's death. The date wasn't chosen for its significance. It was simply the next available slot in the program's schedule. But the timing felt providential, as if God was using even the calendar to remind me that 20 years of anger and grief were enough, that it was time for something new to begin. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, I found myself thinking about Tyler differently. I began to see him not just as the person who had taken David away from me, but as someone who was genuinely trying to honor David's memory through his actions. I learned that Tyler had convinced several young inmates to pursue their education instead of dropping out of the program. He had helped establish a reading program for illiterate prisoners. He had become a certified counselor within the prison system, specifically working with inmates who had committed violent crimes and were struggling with guilt and self-hatred. All of Tyler's work was done in David's memory. He had told other inmates about the young man he had killed, about David's dreams and plans and the good he had wanted to do in the world. Tyler used David's story to help other prisoners understand the full impact of their crimes, to see their victims as real people with families and dreams and potential. Learning about Tyler A.'s work made me realize that David S.'s death had not been completely meaningless. Through Tyler E.'s transformation and his work with other inmates, David E.'s life was continuing to make a difference in the world. It wasn't the difference David had planned to make, building literal bridges and connecting communities through engineering. But it was a different kind of bridge building, connecting broken people to hope and redemption. The night before our in-person meeting, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I would say to Tyler when I saw him face to face, what questions I would ask, whether I would be able to control my emotions. I also thought about David and whether he would approve of what I was doing. In my heart, I felt his encouragement. David had always been a peacemaker, someone who believed in second chances and the power of love to overcome hate. I also thought about the young men I had been working with at the youth center, teenagers who reminded me so much of what Tyler must have been like before drugs and desperation led him to that parking lot. If God could transform a murderer into someone who was dedicated to helping others avoid his mistakes, then there was hope for every young person who had been written off by society. As I finally drifted off to sleep that night, I prayed for the first time in 20 years with complete faith that God was in control. I prayed for strength for the next day's meeting. I prayed for Tyler that our conversation would continue his healing journey. And I prayed for David, thanking God for the son he had given me, and asking for the wisdom to honor his memory through whatever happened next. What transpired in that meeting room the next day would complete my transformation from a bitter, broken woman into someone who truly understood the power of Christ is love to heal the deepest wounds. But the most shocking moment was still to come, when Tyler would reveal something about the night David died that would change everything. I thought I knew about those final moments of my son A.'s life. The Lynn County Correctional Center is not a place designed for healing conversations. The walls are institutional gray, the lighting is harsh fluorescent, and the sound of heavy doors clanging shut echoes through corridors that have witnessed more despair than hope. But on January 15, 2019, God transformed one small room in that place into holy ground. I arrived at the prison with Dr. Chen at exactly 9:08 o'clock in the morning. My hands were shaking as we went through security, as guards checked our identification, as we walked down those long corridors toward the room where I would finally see Tyler Rodriguez face to face after 20 years. With each step, I felt like I was walking toward something that would either destroy me completely or set me free in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The meeting room was simple: a round table with 4 chairs, tissues on a side table, and windows that looked out onto the prison courtyard where inmates in orange uniforms were beginning their work details. Dr. Chen and a prison counselor named Mrs. Patterson would be present for the meeting, but they would remain silent unless either Tyler or I requested their intervention. When the door opened and Tyler walked in, I gasped audibly. The skinny 17-year-old boy from the courtroom had been replaced by a man whose gray hair and lined face spoke of decades of deep thinking and genuine remorse. He was wearing the standard orange prison uniform, but he carried himself with a dignity that surprised me. His eyes, which I remembered as cold and defiant during the trial, now held a sadness so profound that it was almost unbearable to look at. Tyler sat down across from me and immediately began to cry. Not the manipulative tears of someone trying to gain sympathy, but the honest weeping of a man who was finally facing the mother of the person he had killed. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We just looked at each other across that table, 2 people whose lives had been forever connected by the worst night either of us had ever experienced. When Tyler finally found his voice, the first words he spoke were not an apology. Instead, he said, "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for David. Thank you for raising such a good man. Thank you for giving the world someone who made it better, even if it was only for 19 years. Those words broke something open in my chest. In all my imaginings of this moment, I had never considered that Tyler might thank me for David. The idea that my son's killer would express gratitude for David's existence rather than simply apologizing for ending it shifted something fundamental in how I understood this encounter. Tyler continued, "I know that no apology I could ever offer would be adequate for what I took from you, from the world. from David himself. I know that sorry is just a word, and words can bring back your son or give you back the 20 years of happiness you should have had watching him build his bridges and start his family and live his dreams. He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. But I need you to know that not a single day has passed in the last 20 years that I haven't thought about David. Not one day that I haven't wished I could trade places with him, that I could give you back your son and take on myself the punishment of being dead instead of him. Hearing Tyler express a genuine wish that he could have died instead of David was overwhelming. This wasn't the casual remorse of someone going through the motions of a restorative justice program. This was the deep, bone-aching regret of someone who had spent 2 decades wishing he could undo the worst decision of his life. I found my voice and asked Tyler to tell me about that night, about what had led him to that parking lot, about the person he had been when he made the choice to pull the trigger. I needed to understand how someone becomes capable of such violence, not to excuse it, but to comprehend how such darkness can exist in a human heart. Tyler E.'s story was heartbreaking in its familiarity. He had grown up in Des Moines in a neighborhood where poverty and violence were daily realities. His father had left when Tyler was 7, and his mother Maria had worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Tyler had been a decent student through middle school, but when he hit high school, he fell in with kids who were dealing drugs as a way to escape their circumstances. By 17, Tyler was using methamphetamine regularly and dealing small amounts to support his habit. On the night he killed David, he owed money to his supplier and had been threatened with serious violence if he didn't pay up by the end of the week. He had been high for 3 days straight, paranoid and desperate, when he decided to rob someone to get the money he needed. Tyler told me that he had never planned to hurt anyone. He had thought that simply showing the gun would be enough to get money from whoever he targeted. He had chosen David and Jenny almost at random, simply because they looked like college kids who might have cash on them. When David immediately complied and handed over his wallet, Tyler should have taken it and run. But then something went wrong. In his paranoid, drug-addled state, Tyler thought he heard police sirens in the distance. He became convinced that David or Jenny had somehow alerted authorities, though of course they hadn't. When David moved slightly to shield Jenny, Tyler's drug-distorted perception interpreted it as an aggressive action. "I fired without thinking," Tyler said, his voice barely above a whisper. The first shot was pure panic. Then David fell and Jenny started screaming, and I fired 2 more times because I thought, God help me, I thought I needed to eliminate witnesses. Hearing the clinical details of how my son had been murdered was agonizing, but it was also helpful in a strange way. For 20 years, I had imagined David's death as the work of a cold-blooded killer who had enjoyed causing pain. Learning that it was instead the panicked action of a desperate, drug-addled teenager didn't excuse the crime, but it helped me understand that evil sometimes wears the face of brokenness rather than malice. Tyler continued his story, telling me about the immediate aftermath of the shooting. He said that as soon as the drugs wore off enough for him to understand what he had done, he was overwhelmed with horror and remorse. He had called 911 himself from a payphone several blocks away, giving an anonymous tip about the location of the shooting. He had wanted to turn himself in immediately, but his supplier had threatened to kill his mother if Tyler got arrested and potentially implicated others in the drug operation. So Tyler had hidden for 3 days, not eating, not sleeping, just replaying the shooting over and over in his mind and trying to figure out what to do. It was his mother who finally convinced him to surrender to police. Maria Rodriguez had seen the news coverage of David's death and recognized the description of the shooter as possibly being her son. When she confronted Tyler, he broke down and confessed everything. "My mother made me turn myself in," Tyler said. "She told me that whatever consequences I faced for what I had done, running away would only make it worse. She said that the family of the young man I had killed deserved to know that justice would be served, and that I deserved the chance to take responsibility for my actions." Learning that Tyler's mother had been the one to ensure he faced justice gave me a different perspective on Maria Rodriguez. For 20 years, I had hated her by extension, assuming that Tyler's family must be as morally deficient as he had been. But Maria had made the agonizing choice to sacrifice her son's freedom in order to do what was right. She had chosen justice for David over protection for Tyler. As our conversation continued, Tyler asked if he could share something with me that he had never told anyone else, not even his lawyers or the prison counselors he had worked with over the years. He said it was about David's final moments, and he wanted me to know because he thought it might bring me some measure of comfort. My heart started racing. I wasn't too sure I wanted to know more details about my son's death, but something in Tyler's manner suggested that what he was about to tell me was important. Tyler took a deep breath and said, "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to know that David's last words were about you." The room seemed to spin around me. In 20 years, no one had ever told me anything about David's final moments beyond the basic facts of the shooting. Jenny had been too traumatized to remember much, and Tyler had never spoken about the details during his trial. "After I shot him," Tyler continued, his voice breaking, "David was still conscious for maybe 30 seconds. He was lying on the ground, and I was standing over him, and instead of cursing me or expressing anger or fear, he looked up at me and said, 'Tell my mom I love her and that I am not afraid.' I couldn't breathe. After 20 years of wondering about David's final moments, of worrying that he had died in terror or pain or anger, I was learning that his last thoughts had been of love for me and trust in God." Tyler continued. Then he said, "I forgive you, and God will too if you let him." Those were his exact words, Mrs. Thompson. "Your son forgave me before he died, and he told me that God would forgive me too." The room was completely silent, except for the sound of my sobbing. David had forgiven his killer in his final moments. My son, my beautiful, faithful son, had used his last breath not to curse the man who was taking his life, but to offer him the hope of redemption. Tyler waited for me to compose myself before continuing. "Mrs. Thompson, David's words saved my soul." Not immediately. It took years for me to understand what he meant. Years for me to accept that forgiveness was possible, even for someone like me. But every time I wanted to give up in prison, every time I thought about taking my own life because I couldn't live with what I had done, I remembered your son telling me that God could forgive me if I let him. Tyler explained that David's words of forgiveness had haunted him through his early years in prison. He couldn't understand how someone could forgive their own killer, could not comprehend the kind of faith that would lead a 19-year-old to offer redemption to the person who was ending his life. "It was David who led me to Christ," Tyler said. "I started reading the Bible because I wanted to understand what kind of God could create someone capable of forgiving their murderer. I found Jesus because your son showed me what Christ-like love looked like in the final moments of his life. Learning that David had led his own killer to faith was almost too much to process. My son's death had not just been a senseless tragedy. It had been a moment of profound grace that had transformed a lost soul and led him to salvation. David had literally given his life to save Tyler's soul, fulfilling Christ's commandment to love our enemies in the most extreme way imaginable." Tyler told me about his conversion experience, which had happened during his 5th year in prison. He had been attending chapel services regularly, trying to understand the God that David had trusted enough to offer forgiveness to his killer. One Sunday morning, the chaplain had read from Romans 5, verse 8, "But God shows his love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Sitting in that chapel, I finally understood, Tyler said. Christ had died for me while I was still a sinner, while I was still a murderer. And David had shown me that same kind of love, forgiving me while I was still his killer. When I accepted Jesus as my Savior, when I finally believed that even someone like me could be redeemed. Tyler's faith journey hadn't ended with his conversion. He had spent the next 15 years studying theology, earning his GED, and then a bachelor's degree in Christian counseling through correspondence courses. He had become ordained as a prison minister and had dedicated his life to helping other inmates find the same redemption that David's forgiveness had made possible for him. Every person Ivy helped find Jesus, every inmate Ivy counseled away from suicide, every young man Ivy convinced to get his education instead of joining a gang. All of that is David's work continuing through me, Tyler said. Your son is still building bridges, Mrs. Thompson. Not the engineering bridges he planned to build, but bridges between broken people and God's grace. As Tyler spoke about David's continuing impact through his ministry work, I began to see my son's death in a completely different light. David hadn't just been a victim. He had been a martyr in the truest sense of the word, someone who had given his life for the sake of the gospel. His final act of forgiveness had been the seed from which 20 years of ministry and transformation had grown. I found myself thinking about the hundreds of inmates Tyler had worked with over the years, the young men he had helped find education and faith and hope. Each of their lives had been touched by David's forgiveness, even though they had never known my son's name. David's act of grace was still rippling outward 20 years later, still building bridges between broken people and the love of Christ. Looking across the table at Tyler, I no longer saw my son's killer. I saw my son's spiritual son, someone who had been reborn through David's sacrifice and who was carrying on David's work in the world. The transformation was so complete, the redemption so genuine, that I felt in my heart what Jesus must have felt when he looked at Saul of Tarsus and saw the Apostle Paul. "Tyler," I said, my voice steady for the first time since entering that room, "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, and not because I am minimizing what you did to David and to me and to our family. I forgive you because David already did, and because holding on to hatred for someone my son loved enough to forgive would be a betrayal of everything he stood for." Tyler collapsed across the table, sobbing with a relief that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. For 20 years, he had been carrying the burden of his crime, the weight of knowing that he had destroyed a family and ended a life full of promise. Hearing forgiveness from David's mother lifted that burden in a way that even David's final words hadn't been able to do. We talked for 4 more hours that day, and by the time our meeting ended, something miraculous had happened. The bitter, broken woman who had entered that prison visiting room had been transformed into someone who understood the true power of Christ as love to heal even the deepest wounds. And the man who had spent 20 years believing he was beyond redemption had finally received the human forgiveness that completed his spiritual healing. As I prepared to leave the prison that day, Tyler asked if he could give me something. From his shirt pocket, he pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden cross. He explained that he had made it in the prison woodworking shop and had been carrying it for 10 years, waiting for the day when he might be able to give it to me. "I carved this for David," Tyler said. "I wanted to make something beautiful to honor his memory, something that represented the faith he died witnessing to. I've prayed over this cross every single day for 10 years, asking God to bless David's soul and to comfort you in your grief. Taking that cross from the hands of my son's killer was one of the most profound moments of my life. It represented not just Tyler's remorse, but his genuine love for David and his desire to honor my son's memory. It was a bridge, just like the ones David had dreamed of building, connecting the mother who had lost everything to the man who had found salvation through her son's sacrifice." In the months that followed our meeting, Tyler and I began corresponding regularly. His letters were filled with updates about his ministry work, stories about the inmates he was helping, and reflections on his continuing spiritual growth. He sent me copies of the Bible studies he led, the counseling programs he had developed, and testimonies from men whose lives had been changed through his work. I began visiting Tyler regularly, not as victim to perpetrator, but as spiritual mother to spiritual son. I brought him books about engineering, helping him continue his study of David's chosen field. We planned together how to expand his prison ministry, how to reach more inmates with the message of redemption that David's forgiveness had made possible. I also became involved in the restorative justice program that had brought us together, sharing our story with other families who were struggling with forgiveness and healing. I spoke at conferences about the power of grace to transform even the worst situations, about how God can bring good out of even the most terrible tragedies. 6 months after our first meeting, I established the David Thompson Foundation for Restorative Justice and Youth Intervention. The foundation works with at-risk youth in Des Moines and Cedar Falls, providing mentorship, education support, and counseling services designed to prevent young people from making the kinds of choices that led Tyler to that parking lot 20 years ago. Tyler has become one of the Foundation's most effective advocates, corresponding with young people who are struggling with drug addiction, gang involvement, and other risk factors. His story, combined with David's, has helped dozens of teenagers understand that their choices have far-reaching consequences and that there are always alternatives to violence. The Foundation has also established a scholarship fund for inmates who are working to earn their college degrees, and Tyler has been instrumental in developing the curriculum for the program. Every scholarship is awarded in David's name, ensuring that my son's dream of building bridges continues through the education of people who might otherwise never have the opportunity to better themselves. 1 year after our first meeting, Tyler was granted permission to participate in a victim impact program at local high schools. Accompanied by me and a counselor, he speaks to students about the night he killed David, about the 20 years of consequences that followed, and about the redemption he found through my son's forgiveness. These presentations are powerful beyond description. Students sit in absolute silence as Tyler describes his drug-addled decision-making on the night of the shooting, the impact of his actions on David's family and community, and the long journey toward forgiveness and redemption that followed. When I speak about David's life and dreams, about the forgiveness he offered even to his killer, there isn't a dry eye in the room. But the most powerful moment in these presentations comes when Tyler and I stand together at the end, when students can see with their own eyes that genuine forgiveness and reconciliation are possible even in the worst circumstances. We tell them that if a mother can forgive her son's killer, and if a killer can be transformed into a minister of grace, then there is hope for healing in any situation. Many students have approached us after these presentations to say that our story changed their perspective on conflict resolution, on the power of forgiveness, and on the possibility of redemption for people who have made terrible mistakes. Several have credited our presentation with helping them make better choices when faced with opportunities to engage in violence or destructive behavior. 21 years after David's death, Tyler and I have developed a relationship that can only be described as a family bond. He calls me Mom Thompson, and I think of him as the son that God gave me through the sacrifice of my biological son. It sounds impossible, I know, but God's grace has a way of making the impossible not just possible, but beautiful. Tyler's parole hearing is scheduled for next year, after serving 23 years of his life sentence. I will be there to speak on his behalf, to tell the parole board about the man he has become and the good he is doing in the world. If he is released, he has a job waiting with the David Thompson Foundation, where he will continue the ministry work that began with my son as final words of forgiveness. Whether Tyler is released or serves the rest of his life in prison, his transformation stands as a testament to the power of Christ as love to redeem even the worst sinners. David's death was not meaningless. It was the seed from which decades of ministry and healing have grown. My son didn't just want to build bridges between communities. Through his sacrifice and forgiveness, he built a bridge between earth and heaven that has allowed countless people to find their way to God. If you are watching this and struggling to forgive someone who has hurt you, I want you to know that forgiveness is not about excusing evil or pretending that terrible things didn't happen. Forgiveness is about freeing your own heart from the prison of hatred and allowing God to transform tragedy into triumph. It is about choosing to believe that no one is beyond redemption, that no situation is beyond hope, and that love is always stronger than hate. David's story didn't end on that December night in 1998. It continues every time someone chooses forgiveness over revenge, every time an inmate finds faith through Tyler's ministry, every time a young person makes a better choice because they heard about the consequences of violence. My son is still building bridges, still connecting broken people to hope and healing, still fulfilling God's purpose for his life, even though that life was cut short by violence. 21 years ago, I thought my story was over. I thought that losing David meant losing everything that gave my life meaning and purpose. But God took my deepest pain and transformed it into my greatest ministry. He took my son's death and turned it into a fountain of life for others. He took a moment of evil and used it to demonstrate the ultimate power of good. That is the God we serve. That is the grace we can trust. That is the hope that never fails, no matter how dark the circumstances or how deep the pain. If God can take a mother's hatred and transform it into love, if he can take a killer and transform him into a minister, if he can take a senseless tragedy and use it to save souls and change lives, then there is no situation in your life that is beyond his power to redeem. This is the story of my son David, who built his greatest bridge in the final moments of his life. This is the story of Tyler Rodriguez, who found salvation through the forgiveness of the young man he killed. And this is my story, the story of a mother who learned that love is always the final word, no matter what evil may try to write in between. God is still in the business of resurrection. He is still bringing life out of death, hope out of despair, love out of hatred. And if you let him, he will take your broken story and make it beautiful too.